What are you going to lie to your grandchildren about? Let's get into it. I'm here in Austin attending the Council of Colleges of Arts and Sciences meeting, which is an annual meeting of a bunch of arts and sciences deans. But they bring great speakers in and get to network and ask questions and communicate with other deans from around the country. But we had a wonderful opening session today. Lynn Pasquarella, who is the president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is the largest organization advocating for colleges and universities, I think in the world, but certainly in the United States. She made a statement about, in response to a question about the elections this week, and she reminded us about the peer-reviewed research that says that a liberal education mitigates feelings toward authoritarianism or tendencies toward authoritarianism. And she has a great piece, I remember, from a few years back with Frederick Lawrence, who's another person I respect tremendously. He's the secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. They wrote an article together about this in 2020 that's worth looking at. But I think it begs the question if we're not familiar with what liberal education means, because I think for most folks, the word liberal connotes opposite of conservative or some ideological scale. But liberal and liberal arts or liberal education really dates the whole way back to antiquity, and it comes from the Latin liberalis, which is to be free. And the notion was that this is the kind of education that free citizens needed. And of course, back then, every citizen wasn't free. There were enslaved persons, so everybody didn't need it. But in a society such as ours, where we're all free, even those who are incarcerated, many are not incarcerated permanently. These are citizens who together help move society forward. This is the education we need, and it's broad education. It's humanities, and it's social sciences, and it's the natural sciences, and understanding our history, understanding through literature and through poetry and through art, the human experience, about becoming the notion of becoming more human. So the question will be: do we lean into that? Do we think that's valuable as a society, or do we ignore it at the risk of, or even consciously, because we want to lean into authoritarianism? And let me tell you, I think the word fascist was sort of thrown around, especially in the last few weeks of this campaign, and several people who worked or were close to Donald Trump said he's fascist, and then of course Kamala Harris repeated that, and I think that's probably accurate, but I think we need to stop using it as an attack. It's a particular worldview, and I don't know if it's a worldview that exactly matches where Donald Trump or MAGA supporters are. I went back this morning and looked at Mussolini's, it's not a manifesto, but he sort of writes in 1932 about what fascism really means in this worldview. And it's not an exact match to what we're seeing in MAGA. It's 100 years, 90 years ago. But there are some similarities that I think it's worth looking at. There are echoes of what we're hearing here. The similarities are an unwillingness to accept a worldview that's different than ours. And of course, in this particular context in the United States, it's certainly rooted in a fear of the other, a xenophobia, a racism, a misogyny, or sexism. It's certainly rooted in that. Well, remember, democracy is messy, and the value of it, of course, is that it's a collective and that it has legitimacy because people agree that it has legitimacy. But it causes us to have to be patient. We have to wait. We have to sort of think about whether or not we're willing to take losses and then continue to fight. And I think what we've seen since 2020 at least, so I'm not dating this back to coming down the escalator in 2015 or President Trump's first term or his first campaign. I'm talking about the unwillingness to accept that the election went a different way, that Joe Biden won the election. It resonates with folks because lots of people are also tired of seeing constant losses. Year after year, generation after generation. What about us? What about me? And so all the rhetoric about seeing the other as undeserving, but as getting stuff that we, other folks, have worked hard for, people aren't willing to tolerate what they perceive as losses. And so authoritarianism is better if the dictator agrees with me. He can make that happen. And so the Supreme Court decisions giving more presidential power, for instance, to the executive branch, the notion that he can commit criminal acts as long as they're within his duties and not be punished for them after he leaves office, for instance. All of those things are going to help. It may not be directly fascism, even though it is certainly rooted in this notion of country above others, us, our country, who the real Americans, those types of things, and certainly Christianity in a very interesting way that I think is going to play out in the next couple of months and certainly throughout the president's next term. It's there, but I think it's really about this sort of notion of democracy is too messy, it makes me wait too much, it doesn't give me what I want, and certainly not quickly enough. And so let's go another direction. Of course, the flip side of that is if you don't agree with a dictator, you're just trampled upon. And so it's okay when you're in agreement, but if another dictator comes along that disagrees with you, you got to live with those consequences as well. So my question is, and I've asked students this for years, what are we going to lie to our grandchildren about? In 50 years from now, what's the history going to be written? The plenary session during lunch today was from Brian Alexander, who's a futurist, and he sort of talks a lot about climate change. And he's asking us as deans, what are your colleges and universities doing? Not just to combat climate change, like doing things, recycling and solar panels. He's really asking, how are we educating our students to think about the risks of climate change? How are we going to respond when climate change affects us directly? Those types of things. And he asked, what 50 years from now, what is that generation going to say about what we've done now? Think about how we talk about the Jim Crow South. Oh, I can't believe those people. I can't believe, how would they do that? If I was there, I never would have done that. But that wasn't the feeling then. The problem is, the difference here is, and I want to be clear about this, we typically lie about how we felt then. We'll reinvent history, or we'll say we were on the right side of history, even if at the time we weren't. But the difference now is there's a digital footprint for all of this. People who favored racial segregation in Jim Crow South can tell us today, they're in their 90s or whatever, I was against it all along, and we can't prove otherwise. But the folks that are saying things today that 50 years from now are going to be anathema are not going to be able to say, I was on the right side of history, because there's going to be a record that we were not on the right